You're tuning in to Measurement Made Easy, a weekly learning series building our measurement and evaluation skills using real case studies from industry leaders. Hi, I'm Alaina Szlachta, your host and a learning architect creating simple data enablement systems to help us see the outcomes and impact of learning. In today's episode, we explore how to create an assessment that allows us to see the application of behavior after training on the job or in our communities, using a less than favored, historically, tool called self-report. Self-report, as we all know, has a bad reputation for being biased, for not giving us good data. That doesn't mean that it's not possible to use self-report and get good data. That is what today's episode is all about. I hope you enjoy. So before we dive into the meat of our conversation, I want first Larry to introduce himself. He has an amazing background, and the company that he's founded, equally amazing. So Larry, tell us more about you and Rali.
You're way too kind. Thank you so much. No, thanks so much. This is going to be fun. So as you said, I founded Rali, and Rali, we call it a change experience platform. So you're probably familiar with lots of, learning and development platforms. And what we do is we kind of combine the science of learning and development with the science of change management in order to help companies who are doing big change initiatives where success really depends on the shifting of mindsets and behaviors in a way that embeds it into their employee experience and their culture. And as many of you out there probably are familiar with, you can't just send out a bunch of content and hope for the best and really wonder if change is happening. That's not really, we're trying to take it another step further and say, hey, we have an experience that people go through where they can communicate, they can go on journeys together, and they can get access to other great media and content and have a conversation where in our parlance, they learn something, they do something, and they inspire each other. And that's kind of our little secret formula, if you will. Not so secret, I guess, secret formula. But and so prior to this, to your point, Alaina, I was the chief learning officer before I started the company with Children's Healthcare of Atlanta here in Atlanta. Before that, the CLO of the American Express Company, and before that, the CLO of the cell phone division of Motorola, of which I was at Motorola for 20 years. I can't even believe
You're not old enough for that, Larry.
Oh my
Please.
God, are you kidding me? I'm older than dirt. So that's why I have some scars to prove it. How's that?
Mm-hmm. Now that you've met Larry, you can see why I'm so excited for today's case study. So without further ado, let's watch a short clip where we frame the challenge and the opportunity for today's case study. So we are up to a tall order here, Larry. We've got a prescription of how are we going to do this thing that we want to come up with here in a short amount of time. Luckily for me and for you and for the viewing audience, you've done some homework. Woohoo!
Yes, I have.
Actually, we had a conversation before this conversation just to frame our challenge and to make sure that we could come prepared to have a really rich conversation and frame out, okay, we've got this goal. We want to validate how have some of these behaviors been applied in the organization. And so important that we're focusing on a DEI initiative, because I think there's a lot of research and conversation in the world that's like, you can't prove impact of DE&I. It's too soft, fluffy, subjective, whatever. And we're like, no, wait a minute. We can measure, and here's how we're going to do it. And we're not going to measure all the effects. We're actually, I love what you mentioned about the hypothesis. When you designed this program, and there's probably research out there that says
absolutely
people that enact these behaviors, these are the kinds of outcomes that often show up. And that's lovely. I highly recommend that when we are building our hypotheses that we turn to the literature, because we don't have to create causation organically. We can go, ooh, other people have proven these relationships between certain behaviors and certain outcomes. All we need to do is just show how the learning and development initiative that we created actually influenced or not that relationship that's seen out in the world in other environments. So I think our step number one is, okay, what does this assessment tool look like? And then how can we maybe build in, and this might be another conversation or something that we follow up in our part 2 about the environmental piece, because you're absolutely right. We do want to continuously improve learning. The assessment tools and feedback evaluations that we create can really help us do that. But we also want to make sure that we're super small and specific in this step, because sometimes if we get too complicated, it can become overwhelming. We miss the mark, right? So let's start with, how are we going to show application of behavior? And then we'll talk about the impact piece. I'm sure you can see that we have a tall order ahead of us. I'm always up for a good challenge. Are you? Okay, so let's take the next step. Now that we know a little bit about what Larry and I are up to in our case study in this episode, I want to take you to the first step of our process. Of course, that is the behaviors. So anytime that you're designing a learning intervention, you're more than likely targeting key behaviors that you want to change or expand or develop in your target population. So let's learn about the specific behaviors that Larry and his program with Rali were trying to influence through their inclusivity training. That's step number one. We've got to get clear on those behaviors to make sure that we're asking the right questions in our assessment. Here we go. So let's back up, because I think you gave a lot of detailed context, and I want to pull out some of the higher level strategy here so that anyone else watching this can go, ooh, here's how I can apply this in a similar context if I want to do the same. So backing up to the behaviors, you mentioned inclusivity. And I know from talking to you earlier, there are multiple probably types of behaviors that this assessment is going to evaluate. But just for the sake of simplicity, let's say inclusivity is a bucket of type of behavior. Well, how do we know what inclusivity looks like? From what I understand, there are probably 4 or 5, some very specific characteristics of
6. We have 6 that we use.
Yep. Perfect. So give us an example of which one of them, just for the sake of context, so that as we talk about the next step in this process of getting a really great assessment tool from self-report. So what's one of those characteristics that you're going to ask them to self-report on?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you one that's a little broader and give you one that's really pinpointed, okay? Because that's how this works. So the one of them I would say is, the one I would call out is, I call it respectful empathy is the name of the behavior. Mm-hmm. And the description is, it's empathy, not sympathy. Mm-hmm. And it's all about the fact that I demonstrate the ability to understand and appreciate somebody else's circumstances, and I don't feel sympathy for them. So this could be somebody who's maybe had a bad experience, or maybe they've been the subject of bias in some way or another, and I don't blame them for it. I don't, like, all the things that sometimes happen. Mm-hmm. And I understand that, and then I really hear their story, and again I empathize in a way then allows us to open up our conversation and get to know each other deeper in a deeper level. Right. So that's like a specific behavior that then has, as we talked about, it has some micro actions. Mm-hmm. Like, how do I do that? Right. So like, this is like peeling an onion. Any behavior is like my behaviors have a cup of coffee, right? But I mean, then there's like, get the machine out, see, they're all actions. But at the level that we're assessing this in the learning journey, they learn about all the micro ways that they can make that happen. Mm-hmm. Right. And then when they do the do activity, they get an activity guide that has the broad behavior, and then gives them activities they can go do and apply on the job. Okay. So perfect. Now we're coming back.
Before you go any further, let's just break this down. Yes. And just again, in terms of the assessment that we're building. So the respectful empathy, is that an example of a type of behavior that has micro behaviors that you're assessing? Or is respectful empathy one of those micro behaviors that you're asking people to self-report on?
We're going to do it at the level of that as a behavior itself. So respectful empathy is what they're going to be assessing themselves against. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. And just for the sake of time, we'll just use this one because I think it's good. I know you mentioned that there was a broader one versus a more specific. Okay. I think this
That's
one
okay.
is great to work with. So
Yeah.
so just again, context, Larry's creating an assessment that probably has several of these micro behaviors that were being taught as part of the learning journey in the DEI program. As one example of those, it's something I'm going to paraphrase. I demonstrate the ability to understand and appreciate someone else's circumstances. I don't feel sympathy. I hear them, I hear their story, and I use that to create connection. So that's very clear. I think it's very clear. So imagine we have a bunch of these micro behaviors that we're asking people to self-assess that they were taught and got to practice in a learning experience. So the first step in our process is articulating two types of behaviors. One are those bucket or umbrella behaviors. And so in the example that we just heard from Larry, one of the few different buckets of behavior that he's targeting is empathy, or what he calls respectful empathy. And then below that, or a descriptor of that, is going to be a clear statement that makes it as easy as possible for people to know if they've applied that behavior in specific contexts. So that's what you'll do in the first step of this process. Figure out what are those bucket behaviors. Probably you can look to your learning objectives to see what are those behaviors your learning program has targeted. And then the next most important piece is to create really specific statements for each of those behaviors, or statements that describe micro behaviors for each bucket, such that if somebody were to read your assessment, they could go, oh, yeah, I'm doing that, or maybe no, I'm not, or I'm not doing it completely. Has to be that level of clarity. And you could hear in our example how we kind of got in the weeds to get to that level of clarity in Larry's assessment. The next step is we want to assess frequency. So let's tune into how Larry and I unpacked frequency for his assessment. And so one of the questions and opportunities for us is, well, how do we create the drop-down options to measure frequency?
Right.
So there's a standard frequency scale, which you and I both know, and many of our audience members also know, which is like you're never to all the time.
Always, yeah.
Maybe that's the appropriate scale to use. Or maybe we want to make it more specific with regard to the workplace. So
Right.
maybe it's the same frequency scale, but we give it a little bit of context. So every time I have a conversation with, depending on who your audience is, with a member of my team, or right, and does that help us to get better data by adding a little bit more context versus just never do I do this versus I always did this? Maybe we should say sometimes when I talk with my team member, rarely when I talk with my team, but maybe it feels redundant, but that context I think will help us to get better information. And
I'm taking notes.
good. So for everyone who's listening, we can use a simple frequency scale, but when it comes to self-report, we want to make sure that people, when they think about the question, they're answering it from the context that we imagine them answering from. So if we want them to be reflecting on team dynamics when they're using these micro behaviors, then we should put that. I demonstrate such and such behavior, and then your frequency scale always never within the context of teams, or maybe it's even more specific when you have to have a difficult conversation to reprimand somebody or give them constructive feedback. Maybe that's where you imagine them applying this behavior, but I think that would give you better data than leaving it too open-ended. How does
Yeah.
that feel for you?
And actually, that resonates really well with these impact categories, because as I thought about this more, where I've come to, at least for this initial work, is that there's really two impacts. And so what is really, it's my, like, let's say that you and I were coworkers. It's in these one-on-one personal relationships, because sometimes people want to go deeper with others, or they want to repair a relationship that might be important to their working, their work life, and they want to do that. So that's one context of application. And of course, that could be a one-on-one conversation. It could be a coach to manager, whatever it is. The second is in the context of a team that you're on. And so I think if we settle, again, to keep it not too complicated, but if we did that, where we said, what's your frequency of this as it relates to one-on-one personal relationship conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And number two, in the context of a team you're on or lead.
Mm-hmm.
And something like that, and they can like,
Mm-hmm.
and then that will be
Mm-hmm.
incredibly good data.
Yeah.
Incredibly.
Yeah. So functionally, systematically, I always like to give people a visual of, well, how do we build that into the survey tool? There's not going to be a right or wrong answer, but I just want to share with you my very first vision, which is a matrix. So
Yeah.
basically, you would say, in the context of one-on-one conversations, and give a little bit more storyline behind that.
Storyline. Yeah.
Mhm. Tell me, how frequently do you use these behaviors, or whatever word is most
Yeah.
appropriate?
Yeah.
And then you just have the list of the behaviors, and people can mark. It's now, we've simplified. It's the, always, often, I forget the exact scale, you can look it up on Google, but the 5-point scale between always do I do this and never do I do that. But we've given them the context of in your one-on-one dynamics, and then you just mark them down. And then you could do the exact same thing for team dynamics, teams you
Yeah.
lead or teams that you're on, same matrix, different context. And perhaps then you would have, before the training, how often did you do this, and after the training. Now, one thing that might be a little complicated is we're asking them to reflect on the same behaviors before and after, and then individual versus team. One thing that might help you simplify, so that you're not asking people the same thing in different contexts, and then that muddies the data. Back to your hypothesis, are there certain micro behaviors that you hypothesize are going to have a stronger impact on interpersonal relationships? And are there certain micro behaviors that might have a stronger effect on team relationships and dynamics? And maybe you ask about different behaviors, so that you don't have this laundry list of behaviors in a matrix, but you're leaning into a hypothesis. Now, maybe that's over hypothesizing, because
Yeah.
we do want to have some open-endedness also, because we're learning.
Yeah.
We want to, figure out some continuous improvement, but
Right.
I'll let
Right.
you noodle on that. As you can see, there's not one right or wrong way to evaluate frequency and assess frequency. We chose to use a matrix with 2 key contexts to ask people how frequently were they applying these behaviors in one-on-one conversations and also in team dynamics. We chose to use a slightly different format for asking about frequency of those same behaviors after training. The next thing
Yes.
that I want to bring up, you mentioned about the branching. So my suggestion to you, because we don't want to lead people, is you mentioned, and this is where maybe we don't use the same frequency scale. It makes sense to capture how are you applying this
Mhm.
before the training, but maybe you ask more specific application. Like you gave examples of, I apply this sometimes. And you also said, like, I'm not able to apply this. And I think, like, giving those options for people, and each one branches differently. And
Yes.
so instead of asking, like, the assumption I heard, and maybe I heard incorrectly, was that if somebody is applying it highly, almost all the time to always, and then you ask them, what positive changes have you seen? I almost suggest that you just ask, what kind of changes have you seen in your team or an individual? And maybe you ask as a follow-up question, was there anything? Well, you could do it 2 ways. What helped you apply these
Yeah.
behaviors?
Exactly.
And then when the ones that said I didn't apply it as often, or I couldn't apply it, it wasn't applicable, what got in the way?
That's
But
exactly it.
everybody gets the environmental thing, but then there's no positive or negative to the frequency. So
Right.
in your open-ended questions, to make sure not to frame them in a positive or negative way, but just completely open-ended.
That's right. That's right. So yeah, that's exactly where I was kind of headed was, I want to get what, it's like headwinds and tailwinds, right? It's like, what
Mhm.
were the headwinds here? What were the tailwinds here?
That's right. I love that
And
example.
that gives you the power. Now, the other thing I was going to do here, to your point, was when I sat down and thought about like what are, if I gave people let's say that people just have a really hard time articulating this, which is one of our hypotheses, is that people struggle with this a little bit. It really turns out that, well, my hypothesis is that there's I've got like 6 or 7 impact statements that they could choose from at the end of the whole thing. So it's like, I've given you, but I really want to point out that this is really what impacted me. So can I give you an example? Here's what I'm thinking. So, these are both personal and then team, right? So personal relationships. I have deepened or recovered a relationship that impacts the organization or business. Like this helped me do that. Number 2, this is all about quality of decision making. Personal decision. I am making better decisions by including multiple voices, multiple viewpoints. Number 3, team idea. My team has generated new useful ideas by including more voices. Team problem solving. My team is solving problems more effectively. Team decision making. My team is making better decisions by engagement. I am aware. I am aware of an individual that have increased their engagement with the organization. You can't ask these folks like, is our retention numbers going up because of this? But I think you could ask. And again, these are just ideas. I'm aware of an individual at risk that has made a decision to stay with the organization. So these kinds of things are trying to double click one down. The last one I thought of as you were talking just now was, the ultimate goal of this work at a feeling level, and then there's a lot of science that relates this to business outcomes, is the word belonging. And so this idea that I feel an increased sense of belonging with the organization, while that's not an impact, it's an impact to me. The evidence chain beyond that is indisputable in terms of, there's a company called Coqual that's done all of this really statistical analysis against behavior, belonging, and business outcomes. And so I don't know that I need to go that far. Do you know what I'm saying? But maybe I should ask the belonging question within here. These are just my ideas for now.
So what I hear is that we want to check first for frequency of application of behaviors pre-post. Then in the post asking, we're going to have specific branching logic that gives people a chance to share open-endedly the changes that they saw. And I love that, the headwinds and tailwinds about what got in the way, if they indicated they weren't able to apply them, and then what really helped them in instances where they did get higher levels of frequency of application. Awesome. So this next layer, I love that you're thinking is it's another triangulation of data opportunity. So back to the beginning of our conversation, you told us that you're capturing some of those applications of behavior in your learning platform. Awesome. That's one data point. But we want to make it stronger. So now we're doing this self-report assessment. Now we've got some data on application. We've got some data on open-ended stuff. And what you're suggesting is that let's maybe cross-check what people are saying in the open-ended questions versus some close-ended stuff, because at the end of the day, this is still a hypothesis. So it gives you a chance to then say, here's what we believe are the buckets of impact that will happen. And then you can compare that with what people said changed.
So Larry and I were able to get the best of both worlds in our overall assessment approach. So let's back up for a second and just review the steps of this particular process. Step number 1, what are those buckets of behaviors that your training program was designed to influence? Step number 2, what does a characteristic or a micro behavior look like, so that how do I know I'm applying respectful empathy? There would be at least one key descriptor, or maybe in some cases you might have multiple characteristics or multiple micro behaviors for those buckets of behavior. Totally depends on the length of your training, what you included in the learning experience. So, step number 3, assess frequency. So we chose to assess frequency by using a matrix to ask before training how frequently people were applying those behaviors in 2 different contexts. And then you saw in our final clip that we chose to ask about use statements to ask people about the frequency of the behavior after training, such that we could use branching logic to ask 2 key follow-up questions. One being, what were those headwinds and tailwinds that helped people or maybe hindered people in applying those behaviors? Could be environmentally, could be timing, it could be anything. We wanted to capture that. And then secondly, we also wanted to ask people in an open-ended way, what came about because people were using these behaviors, or you yourself were using these behaviors in the workplace. So we could capture some of that just open-ended feedback and open-ended impact from each user's perspective. And we triangulated, or we compared that open-ended feedback with closed-ended impact statements, asking people to indicate, yes, these things happened after the training program. So it's quite a simple but yet robust approach to using self-report to evaluating how were certain behaviors applied on the job after training. I hope that this has helped you and at least given you something to think about. If you have any questions, if you want to tell us how you might be using the strategy or thinking about it, please do so in the comment section below. Of course, you're welcome to subscribe to this channel for our weekly on-demand series, or of course, tune in live if you want to get some mentoring or some conversation with people like me who are also trying to build their measurement and evaluation skills. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.